Later on today's episode of On the Other Hand.
I think this idea that free speech means good speech will crowd out and counter bad speech, there's a problem with that.
This is On the Other Hand, a podcast that features community leaders in Arkansas sharing their views and experiences on how to make Arkansas better.
In the first part of our Red Blue conversation, April and I began sharing our perspectives on the issue of free speech. I was coming from a primarily blue standpoint, while April represented more of a red perspective. So let's get now to the second part of our Red Blue conversation. Is there a point reached where a speaker spreads such false or hateful, vindictive, or otherwise, problematic language that constitutes a legitimate reason for limiting their speech? Because campuses, they have the right to choose who they invite. I think they should invite a variety of people, which is, I think, the point of the heterodox academy, to have a variety of viewpoints. I totally agree with that. In fact, it kind of goes with this notion that most people have heard, that because we have free speech, we have to put up with bad speech, with some degree of inaccurate speech and even hateful speech. And that the way to counter that bad speech, if I can use that phrase, is more speech, just more speech on the other side. The other side offer its views, offer what its argument for why that other side is inaccurate, and here's what the accurate issue is. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. I will say this, though. I mean, based on some of my looking into the research in psychology and other of the social sciences, I have come to appreciate it's a little more complicated than that, because I think this idea that free speech means good speech will crowd out and counter bad speech, there's a problem with that. That was the Enlightenment notion, back a few hundred years ago, that we don't need to be doing all this magical thinking and engaging in superstition. People are rational. And if we provide accurate information, people will then be able to make good choices. The problem with that is that the research in this area is very clear. Most decisions that we make and most beliefs that we entertain tend to have emotional origins, sometimes related to tribalism, but those origins of our beliefs are well established. If you take a person who has a portion of their brain that has been damaged, that limits their ability to experience and express emotions, now, not only do they have difficulty with emotions, they have difficulty making decisions, making up their minds. That's been well established. And the thing is that most of us, when we espouse our decisions and beliefs, we're doing that and we give rational reasons why, when in fact, we're just doing like what Jonathan Haidt said in his book about the rider and the elephant, which we've used several times in our discussions here. The rider is the higher part of the brain, the rational part. The elephant is all the massive emotions and tribal instincts and things. And when an elephant goes somewhere, its direction of walking is determined primarily not by the rider directing it, but by the emotions steering the elephant in whatever direction. And the rider simply makes up a story to explain why it went that way. That's actually how most things happen. So what to me that says is there's a real problem with just relying on more speech and better speech. It kind of reminds me of this 5-to-1 rule about relationships. If you want to improve relationships, you need to have many more positive interactions with that person than you do negatives. So you need to limit your negative interactions, shut up when you could say something that would be offensive. And you also need to look for opportunities to have positive moments, that 5-to-1 rule. Maybe we need to learn and teach people about some sort of 5-to-1 rule when it comes to speech, that if somebody's exercising what we might call bad speech, we have to make a concerted effort to get a lot more of the accurate information and speech out there. So there's a couple of thoughts for you.
Yeah, and I agree with you that more speech doesn't solve the problem. It certainly is one of the ways of doing it, of upholding free speech is to, you know, we need to have the opportunity to question information that's being shared. We need to be able to have the right to have speech that counters speech. So, truthful information we would hope would be more persuasive. But we have seen on both sides, conservative and liberals, conspiracy theories are believable and believed. And it's not always the more speech that persuades them. It's the relationship building within those settings where we try to have, I mentioned courageous conversations, or courageous, compassionate curiosity, I think, as somebody else called it, but courageous curiosity, where we actually are trying to understand where they're coming from and not just and hearing their stories, which is one of the things that if a person really wanted to get involved in having one-to-one conversations in the Braver Angels way, they would actually start asking what are the values underlying what you're saying. What are the stories that led you to this? We oftentimes in our podcast start out with asking people to tell us about how'd you grow up and how'd you get where you are. And I think we're trying to humanize the person so that it's not just about their belief system, but it's also about them as a human being, and creating environments in which we can do that is really helpful. But managing misinformation within a free speech framework, that is so hard, because you want to be able to combat falsehoods without undermining the foundational freedom that we have to express divergent views. And sometimes misinformation has some truth to it, right? And so there's something that people are holding on to that does need to be heard. I think about what we do in Braver Angels in terms of our debates. And we're really trying to support this idea of rebuttal and discussion of differences over silencing it, and challenging people's thoughts publicly. And I would encourage folks who are listeners who have not attended a Braver Angels national debate to attend one. They've had some fascinating ones in the last few months over the first 100 days of the presidency of Donald Trump, and those are on the Braver Angels YouTube channel if people want to re-listen to those. But if you participate in those, and Glenn, I know you and I have both participated in those debates, they always have people speaking on a resolution, and the resolution is controversial. So it might be something about Donald Trump is making America great again. Okay, that might be the resolution, right? So it's got a clear people who can speak for or can speak against. And they take turns, and they have specific ground rules that they use for how we are able to talk and actually ask questions of the side that we disagree with. And it almost takes that kind of structure if we're going to have speech against speech. So I think about iron sharpening iron in the Old Testament of the Judeo-Christian tradition. And I think it's in Proverbs, iron sharpens iron. And I think about there's certain speech that does sharpen the other speech, but just spouting facts and not listening. You mentioned the lap perspective at the beginning, which basically is I'm listening to what you're trying to say. I am then acknowledging, paraphrasing back what I'm hearing you say, maybe pointing out the points where we might have agreement or concerns, common concerns, before I ever then would pivot to ask for permission to share my perspective. Now that's in a conversation, not in a debate setting. But even when I'm sharing my perspective, I share it as tentative, as I message as an I believe this. I maybe have a little bit about my story. It's not just facts against facts, because that has been shown in the research that that does not change the other person's opinions. It actually creates more entrenchment of their opinions into where they were starting, their starting place. So I do think about the debates that I've attended and the structures that they put into them, and how I walk away from those with different ideas than I had before, and a more, we call it sometimes in Braver Angels, nuanced, a more nuanced perspective, and realizing it's not as simple as I thought it was. So if a person's arguing that Donald Trump is making America great again, a person who's listening to us might have an immediate reaction, positive or negative, to that. But if you listen to all these people in a 2-hour debate talk about it, they're going to point out places where they actually might agree and might disagree with that. It's not simply yes or no. And that's where I think we have to get beyond when we're having open debate and supporting this counter speech, is we have to have structures that allow us to challenge the misinformation publicly, but do it in a way that's relationship based. If it's calling a person into a relationship where I'm understanding them, but we also need a place where we can call out these things, but do it in a way that can be heard and understand the nuances of the other side's perspective.
Okay. I really appreciate what you had to say. There are a lot of things to unpack there, but there were a few key points. And the very first thing I want to say is you added something critically important when you talked about building relationships, because I was talking about the idea of um, rational, facts not being enough to overcome emotion. And I talked about the 5-to-1 rule. Maybe we need to have a lot more of the facts, and that may be, but the more powerful influence, I believe the evidence shows, is the power of relationship. And that's one of the things that you point out we try to do at Braver Angels. We try to teach people skills that will help facilitate at least lowering the emotional temperature when people disagree, and also maybe help build the relationship. And if people are able to continue to have a conversation about their differences without getting too far afield into the nasty stuff, then then you tend to have a relationship developing. So I think that's really, really important. The idea of relationship building as maybe the key antidote to bad speech, as I was talking about it. The rational, factual part, it's still relevant for all its limitations, but it's an uphill climb. You have to do it repeatedly. As an individual, you have to look at yourself, be self-aware and self-critical, and willing to acknowledge when you maybe are holding on to something that's inaccurate, and that's not easy to do for any of us. So that's an important point. We also have the idea that you talked about the limitations of facts. The research shows the incredible strength of appeals to emotions, especially fear and anger. And we hear a lot of that. Our leaders and business and everything have learned that if you can appeal to emotions, you can get your message across a lot more effectively than just information and facts. So we know that facts don't overcome the fear, the emotion. We have to do that in another way. So that's a critical point. People need to have that self-awareness to look at that sort of thing. You also talked about misinformation, disinformation, and the problems we have. That was one of the places I was going to go to, because that's another thing. It's like an example of that online in social media. What should be the proper role of social media companies in limiting online speech if it's hate speech, if it's inaccurate, if it's spreading false information. Now, you would think that because they are private corporations and not the government, they're better able to do that. But I know that's been a criticism, particularly from the right, that social media companies, maybe they're saying they're mostly liberal and then they're trying to favor liberal speech. I don't see it that way. To me, it's very much regardless of whether it's liberal or conservative. The key is whether or not it is factual, but even more so, is it taking advantage of that inherent tendency for people to be driven by the emotions, by fear and by anger. That's a real concern. I don't know what the answer is, but I do think there's a legitimate argument for non-governmental organizations like social media and so on to exercise some discretion there. Just as it would mean that, like for instance, Elon Musk with X, he as much as I might not like it, he has the right, given that it's a private company of his, that he can um, skew the debate toward bad information or lots of one side without hearing the other side, and to use fear and anger and things like that to get his advantage. I think that happens a lot with Fox News and other outlets like that too. So it's a really tough one for me as a liberal to say, how do I deal with that without interfering with free speech? Maybe other people brighter and more informed than me have some ideas, but it's a real concern I have.
Glenn, as you were talking about this, I agree, by the way. But I've heard you talk off of the podcast about the passion that you have for confronting misinformation and disinformation both. And I struggle with this. I really do, because I think about, well, whose facts are we going to actually consider? Let's just take and this will take us down a rabbit trail that I don't want to go down, but might lead us to a different discussion eventually. But let's take the COVID thing.
Mm-hmm.
Was Anthony Fauci actually telling us lies? Was the government, when they told us to do masking, telling us lies? We all know that there's propaganda, right? If you ever look at, and we sometimes want to believe that the government is the source of truth, right? But our government, the U.S. government, over the years in the world wars, was a propaganda machine. Okay. And people who study mass communication or mass media, they talk about and they study that. It's like, and they use it for purposes that are strategic, to persuade, to make us appear a certain way in the world. I'm not saying that it shouldn't be, but it's more of a public relations kind of way of doing news than it is actual fact based. But when we think about vaccines, and I think about, you and I may actually have more agreement on this, RFK, for example, and measles. How many times have I had a measles vaccine? Did my kids get a measles vaccine? Yeah. So we're now going to alienate some of our listeners who are anti-vaxxers, but they're getting their facts from a different place than I'm getting my facts. And I don't know that their facts are incorrect because I've not looked at them. And I'm also not a scientist. Is there something that is correct about what they're saying? Is there something correct about what I believe? I don't know the answer, Glenn. And that's where I struggle with this, shutting down of a particular kind of thing, suppressing speech, because maybe we have to define, maybe what the issue is, we have to define what harm is. Having clear legal lines for what is harmful. I certainly think medical disinformation that causes harm could be a legal line that we draw in the sand. And we need to be looking at best, studies that are double-blind studies that are, that scientifically regardless of whether a person is a Republican, Democrat. Scientific studies should not be politically slanted. And yet I know that studies that are sponsored by pharmaceutical companies potentially have an interest behind them. Okay.
Yes, they do.
That might be different than a study that is just a study, but most scientific studies are sponsored by agencies. Okay. So are those agencies politically neutral? I don't know the answer to that. And I'm not arguing that they are or aren't, but medical disinformation seems like a clear harm. If I'm seeing an advertisement that says that this particular drug does this, and I don't see it could also do this. I mean, what do we have? All these drug commercials now that have to legally say, here are the things that it does, but here are the possible side effects. They have to do that. That was legally mandated because they were trying to avoid false advertisement. Okay, other legal lines of harmful misinformation that aren't health related. Defamation. We have defamation lawsuits, right? When a person defames. Another one could be fraud. FBI or CIA or other people, agencies, federal agencies actually say, if you say this and you are defrauding people out of money, then you are legally held responsible. I think another one, and this was a little bit harder to unpack, is whenever that misinformation incites people to violence. And so violence against, and I would argue it's not just against people, but violence against property, which does also impact people. So those clear legal lines for what is harmful, which I think we've done a pretty good job of in the law over time, to help us uphold the constitutional right to free speech, I think is important.
Boy, I'm thinking we may have to, in one-on-one conversations, you try to look for common ground. I think we're going to have to look for places where we differ. I've not heard many things that I differ with you on. You make a lot of good points. Where to start? So much. Okay, so you were just talking about basically categories of unprotected speech, what the legal landscape has come probably through Supreme Court decisions to recognize that there are some categories of speech that have limited or no First Amendment protection. So I'll kind of cite briefly these because some of those are kind of what you're getting at. One is incitement. This is speech that is directed and likely to produce imminent lawless action. And for that, I'm just wondering, are you familiar with the term doxing?
I've heard it, but I don't know what you mean by
okay,
it.
I think I've got this one right. Doxing is that practice that's developed in recent years where people like post the name and address and phone number of controversial people who hold opinions on one side online so that others can maybe play mischief with them. That's what doxing is.
That's violating life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Well, it's done a lot now, and the question is, I don't know that there's been any action. I don't think anyone's been arrested for it. And if you do, what do you charge them with? And would it hold up in court? If it went to the Supreme Court, would the Supreme Court say, yeah, this is another one of those things that fits within the broad category of incitement? I don't know, but it is certainly troubling. One could argue that just because you list that doesn't mean that people are invariably endangered. Maybe most people will see that and say, well, I don't care. Some people have done this is another thing that's gotten to be big recently is, I don't know why, but ordering pizzas delivered to people. I know it doesn't make sense, but I think the idea is that we know where you are and we know what you're about, that kind of thing. So that's an example of where we're at the cutting edge now in several ways of dealing with free speech and its limits. And I expect that's something at some point we're probably going to see take a legal route to find out
You
when is
know,
it okay, when is it not.
this brings up this is not okay, whether this will go on this particular episode or not, I don't know. But this brings up a thought that I had not thought about until you just now brought it up. There's been criticism right now of our current national legislators, right? Why aren't on the Republican side? Why aren't they standing up to Donald Trump on the excesses and abuses? And I will have to say, I do not like his use of free speech as a president. I think a president should be held to a higher level of standard of speech. This is because I am an Aristotelian, virtuous person. Okay. I really believe that our leaders ought to be held to this higher ethical standard, just like I try to hold myself to a higher ethical standard
But
as a department chair.
you said ethical. Notice the distinction between ethical and legal, because as I said before, the responsibilities are moral but are not enforceable legally. Maybe that's what's coming up.
Right. But here's the thing, that going back to what you're saying is I read something recently where where the assumption is that the Republican legislators that are not standing up to Trump, and and who knows, I mean, in their heart of hearts, are doing it because of fear. And I thought initially when that person said that it was fear of Trump, right? But now I'm thinking this doxing thing you're talking about, they're probably also fear of supporters that are the henchmen, maybe too strong of a word. It doesn't sound like I'm conservative when I'm saying this, okay? But you can be conservative and not and call out abuses, okay?
Yeah.
And I want people to recognize that even you could be liberal and call out abuses on if there was a Democrat in the White House, okay?
Right.
And so are they afraid of the henchmen, right? The people that do not hesitate to go and do violence against people that they believe are really hurting our country. And I think there is that's what do we do when we believe somebody is really hurting something that we love?
Mm-hmm.
And do we have the right to speak against them? Free speech, what we're talking about. Do we have the right to harm them? And what does harm look like? It kind of goes back to that question. I don't have the answers here. It made me think when you were talking about doxing that perhaps one of the things that they're scared about is they're scared of getting called out and actually their families experiencing harm. So that could be another reason why they are not standing up for or standing up against.
Or standing up for constitutional limits. Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And I've long thought that's part of the motivation of people on the right, on the Republican side, who may not otherwise stand up to Trump, because there's a clear history in his movement of some of his. Most people are not violent and aggressive who are favor Trump, but some are, and he has a significant percentage who I think most people would agree are willing to do violence against people that oppose Trump and his ideas. And so those are the people that I suspect, like you're saying, the Republican legislators in D.C. are worried about, that, people will come after them. The other, maybe less defensible basis for fear is the fear that the base will be angry with them if they speak against Trump, and then they will not get reelected or they get less money. To me, that would be a pretty vacuous motivation for not standing up for the Constitution and what they think is right. But that's a good discussion there. But all that came from that idea of doxing. So that's just an example of the difficult balancing acts we have in trying to honor our right to free speech and figuring out where the limits are. And as with most things here, it's an ongoing process, and eventually over the years we'll have some cases come through the judicial system, get to the Supreme Court, who will make rulings of it. And then if those rulings become really objectionable by a lot of people, then we may have a law passed by Congress, or maybe even constitutional amendments to correct that. Because it's certainly true that the Supreme Court sometimes doesn't get things right. They do things that are really bad decisions. We know history shows us that for sure.
Well, that's it for the second part of April and Glen's red-blue conversation with each other. We'll continue this conversation in the next episode, so be sure to check out part 3. And remember that this podcast offers dozens of other interviews like this one, and you can find them on your favorite podcast app or on the podcast page at arkansas.braverangels.org. On the Other Hand is sponsored by Braver Angels in Arkansas. Music was composed by Randall Standridge of Jonesboro, Arkansas, and was performed by the University of Northern Colorado Symphonic Band, Dr. Richard Main, conductor.
From your host, Glenn White
and April Chatham Carpenter.
Join us in working to make our relationships and communities better.